Right. We're talking about groups and organizations this week, right? And I hope everyone's doing well out there. I'm going to try to, I know I've said this before, but I'm going to try to make this video a little bit shorter for you guys. Hopefully, I'll be able to accomplish it this time. All right. And the kids aren't home, so hopefully, we won't get disturbed either. So, I guess the first thing that I want to point out is so far in this class, we've been focusing either on micro sociology or macro sociology, right? This is a distinction that was made at the very beginning of this class in chapter 1. There's micro phenomenon that has to do with individuals, right? And there's macro that has to do with large scale institutions and society and things of that sort, right? What we're going to talk about today kind of sits in the middle of those two things, right? And sometimes this is referred to as meso-level sociology, right? So it's not societies, it's not individuals, it's groups and organizations, right? And the first distinction that I want to point out is when we talk about groups, there's primary groups and there's secondary groups, right? A primary group tends to be small, right? And its members share personal and enduring relationships, right? Your best friends, your family, right? Those are primary groups. Secondary groups, in contrast, are large and personal, and they're devoted to some specific task. Like when I go to work, right? That's the secondary group. This class is an online virtual secondary group, right? And because of that, we have a goal. I have a goal to teach the content of this class. You have a goal to learn the content, make a good grade, and so on. Some of y'all I might keep in touch with later, but a lot of y'all after this class is over, to the end of it, and after this job ends for me, I probably won't keep in touch with a lot of people that I've worked with, maybe some, right? And to the extent that I do keep in touch with those people, that's an example of how a primary group can be nested in a secondary group, right? Yeah. So secondary groups, the point is some goal, right? Occupations, making money, political groups, civic groups are secondary groups. Primary groups, kind of the goal is the group itself, right? So like family or your best friends or something like that, right? The point of that is keep the family together, keep your friendships going, right? All right, so that's the first distinction, right, between primary and secondary groups. And if I show a lot of emotion at work, if I cry or something like that, it's kind of not really appropriate in a secondary group, right? But among my family, primary groups, that's expression of emotions perfectly acceptable, right? All right. The next thing that we'll talk about in relationship to groups is leadership. Who leads the group, right? And the nature of that leadership. There tends to be two different types of leadership. This is what we call instrumental, goal-directed, right? And then there's also expressive, which is more about collective well-being, right? I've belonged to organizations, and some focus on like, how's everybody doing out there? And, how are you feeling? How do you want to express that? And then others, are about results, right? I've certainly had jobs at sales where it's like how many units can you sell in a given month or something like that, right? There are also, all right, so that's instrumental versus expressive leadership. It's not real complicated. The next thing is about leadership and styles of decision making. And this is authoritarian leadership styles, democratic leadership styles, and laissez-faire leadership styles. Authoritarian is, like authoritarian governments, right? It's a person at the very top that makes all the decisions, and they don't care. They don't seek input from people below. It's like a dictator, right? Primarily focus upon instrumental concerns, right? Takes charge of decision making and demands strict compliance by all the people that are below the leader, right? The second type, in a lot of ways quite different than authoritarian leadership style, is a democratic leadership style. Puts things to vote, or at least gets people's input before they make a decision. So it is more expressive and tries to include everyone in the decision-making process, right? That's democratic leadership. And then the last is what we call laissez-faire, right? Which borrows this term from classic economics, right? Which means French, I believe, for hands-off, right? Hands-off policy, right? Just allows the group to function with very little intervention by the leader, right? Those are three types of leadership styles. And, a lot of times in my face-to-face class, we talk about, presidents and try to categorize them in each one of these, right? And we also discuss, which one you think is best, right? And at the end of that discussion, where we kind of try to reconsensus about which presidents are authoritarian, which are democratic, which are laissez-faire, I then introduce an idea that, if you're going to be really good, effective leadership for a long period of time, that you will pick your leadership style depending upon the social conditions at that time, right? This is the idea that presidents, very good president can kind of see what's happening in the world, and perhaps if we're in wartime, right, we might need someone that's a little bit more authoritarian. If we're having civil unrest, and much of it is about the rights of individuals, for example, during the civil rights movement, right? We don't typically put civil rights to a vote, right? That's contrary to how we think about civil rights, right? Someone takes charge, right, and says we're going to now extend these rights to people that previously did not get them, right? There have been some very good presidents that were probably more authoritarian in their leadership style, right? Abraham Lincoln, for example, right? Great president, no doubt, right? But during civil unrest, a civil war, and stuff like that, we shouldn't just follow the majority opinion, right? The leadership has to do what he thinks is right for the country. And, and then other times, in times of peace, maybe a democratic leadership style is more appropriate, right? In times of peace and of economic prosperity, probably a laissez-faire leadership style, right? And so what I'm challenging is like, don't think of these as some as good, some as bad, but they, as a leader, you might be called to adjust to what's happening in the organization or in the country if we're talking about presidents. And you might have to shift from one of these to the next depending upon changing social conditions, right? Now, all right, so, but you'll probably still have a favorite of these, right? I know that if you're not the leader, that authoritarian leadership is typically not a whole lot of fun to work under. And I have experienced that at times. And the next things that are talked about are Solomon Asch's conformity experiment and then Stanley Milgram's obedience study. Now, I'm not going to talk about those in great detail because we have a discussion board that does that and shows you this video. Just know that one is on conformity. That's Solomon Asch's with the lines. The other, Stanley Milgram, where people believe that they're shocking people, right? That is on obedience, right? So one's conformity, but the other one is conformity to authority, and we call that obedience, right? So I'll let you watch those videos on both of those, and I won't go into great detail explaining both of those really classic social experiments, right? There's a discussion upon this concept of groupthink, and this is a concept that was put forth by Irving Janis, right? And it argues that in groups there can be a tendency for group members to conform by adopting a narrow view of some issue, right? So let me give you examples, right? You might have heard this term from politics. It's like you don't want to surround yourself with yes men. You don't want to surround yourself with people that just always agree with you, right? And always try to please you, right? You want to have some people in the room that play the devil's advocate, that challenge you, right? And the reason why you want this is you want to prevent groupthink from happening, right? And let me give you, oh boy, there's some kind of classic examples of this that most of y'all probably will not be aware of. There was an attempt to arm Cuban refugees that were in the United States to invade Cuba. This happened in the 60s and happened under John F. Kennedy's presidency. And it was a huge failure, right? I mean, it did not liberate Cuba. Cuba continues to be under communist control to this day, right? And the CIA funded and armed these refugees from Cuba that were living mostly in Florida, and gave them weapons, gave them money. And when they went back to Cuba and tried to liberate the people of Cuba, right, it was a huge failure. Many people died, right? And a lot of people were kind of left wondering, like, why would John F. Kennedy, a very popular president, how could he fail this miserably? And one of the explanations was groupthink. They were just, everyone in that room that made that decision at that time just wanted to agree, wanted to please the president, didn't want to challenge him. And when that happens, groups can make really bad decisions, and they're often surprised that they turn out bad, right? And there's a couple of other examples. When I was young, we had a couple of space shuttle disasters, right? And there were reasons why that day we probably should not have launched the space shuttle, right? And when they used to launch the space shuttle, NASA did, they would wheel a TV into little kids' classrooms all the country, and you watch it take off into space, and it was real patriotic and celebratory and stuff. Most of the time, but there was one. I think it was Challenger. It was the name of the space shuttle, and I was in a classroom as a young kid, and with all my classmates were watching this, and the whole thing blew up and killed all the people inside, right? And when they did an investigation, they did find some problems, like with these O-rings, but most of the error was really groupthink. It was this, faulty decisions that were made among people in groups, right? Where they just adopt this narrow view, right? And they knew that those O-rings shrank and it could cause a problem with fuel leaking, but they decided just to push on and discount those people that were voicing concerns, right? All right, that's groupthink. Sorry, my examples are really old. I guess I could try to think of some. Oh boy, I could think of some, but I'm not sure they'd be well received. All right, moving on away from groupthink, and let's talk about reference groups, right? Usually when we compare ourselves to others, we don't look up statistics and am I a smart person? Am I a dumb person? Am I tall or am I short? Right? Most of us wouldn't go look at the average IQ, right? Instead, what they do is they compare themselves to people in their reference group, right? So like when I was in high school, I had several other friends that I took classes with, and we competed for grades, right? And every time that we got a test back, it's like, oh, who do best? And look over everyone's shoulder, and and some days they did better, and some days I did best, right? And that was kind of my reference group, right? And we do that with all sorts of things, right? We don't compare ourselves to the statistical average. We compare ourselves to those people that we hang out with, that we interact with quite often, right? That is a reference group, right? And and so that can cause people to misperceive what how smart they are, how tall they are, how much they drink, all sorts of things. Let me give you some examples, right? Most of my examples come from the study of substance use and crime and things of that sort, right? And there's this common phenomenon that happens among people who seek treatment for alcoholism, for example, drugs as well, right? Now, usually when people are heavy drinkers and they've kind of reached a point where it's becoming problematic in their life, usually they're drinking with other heavy drinkers, right? And they have a tendency, because of this phenomenon reference group, to think everyone drinks like that. And it's hard for them to imagine that people don't drink, right? In fact, sometimes when people show up at places like treatment centers, they just don't believe that there's people that used to drink like them and now they don't drink, or used to use drugs and now they don't, right? It's just, that's that reference group, right? You compare yourselves to the people that you hang out with a lot, not to the statistical average or mean, right? I don't know, you could say something similar to like how attractive people think they are. Well, you know what? Attractive people tend to hang out with other attractive people. Less attractive people tend to hang out with other less attractive people, right? And that can distort people's perceptions of their own attractiveness in other people's, right, based upon that reference group. All right. There's also some research that was done by a fellow named Stover. This is research from back in the 40s, right? And there's a strong tendency when humans interact with other people, particularly in groups, we divide the world into in groups and out groups. Groups that you belong to and groups that you don't belong to, right? And there's something about human beings that, like, this is almost inevitable, right? It's kind of like tribalism or something like that, right? An in-group commands your esteem, your loyalty, right? But an out-group which is a group that someone feels competition toward, right, or opposition to. It's going to be all sorts of groups. Certainly, you see this in like Republican, Democrats, right? You also see this with groups divided over class, upper class, lower class. You see this among racial and ethnic groups, for sure, right? That's in and out groups, right? Because humans are these social animals, right? Something that I'm sure I've said 100 times before in this class. We're these social animals. We just tend to think like this, right? It's now we can attempt to reduce it and not make it, as bad as it's been in the past, right? But it's hard to completely prevent, right? Most people think that the groups that they belong to are better than the ones they don't belong to. Think of all the cliques like jocks and stoners and in high school, right? Or the I don't know, cheerleaders. Most people that belong to a group, they think that group's better than the other groups, right? They don't think they're just different, right? And that's pretty important, right? Sorry, I got distracted. I'm trying to sell a bunch of stuff on Facebook Marketplace, and people are just kind of constantly bothering me and stuff. All right, so that's everything about in groups and out groups, right? Now there's another guy, right? There's just some different ideas, right? It's a guy named George Simmel, and he's an important early symbolic interactionist, right? I mean, back during the late 1800s, right? Kind of life goes into the early 1910s and teens, right? And he has something that he kind of calls like social geometry. So he argues that just the number of people in the group changes group dynamics, right? And he talks about a group with 2 people, that's a dyad. A group of 3 people, that's a triad. So no dyads and triads, right? And here's how, whether it's 2 people or 3 people in those groups, changes things. And you might have experienced this before, right? In a dyad, which is 2 people, social interaction tends to be really intense. One person can withdraw and the group ends, right? Triads tend to be a little bit more stable, right? One person can withdraw, the group remains. Of course, it won't be a triad anymore, right? But also, the group dynamics are so that 2 people can form a coalition and overvote the one person, right? Now, whenever I talk about this, I always think about like if you ever had a roommate and you decided to get a third roommate, right? Or if you and a friend are going out to dinner and you decide to invite one more person, and they're like, where are we going to go for dinner? Like two people want one thing, the other person wants to go to some different restaurant or something like that. That's dyads and triads, you know. It's also like, you know, you go on a date and you bring a third person along, right? Goodness, I'm kind of lost. Like, what do we call that? Like third wheel, right? Third wheel. All right, that's dyads and triads, right? And the important thing about that is George Simmel's ideas. It's like, you know, just the number of people can affect how group dynamics play out, right? Whether it's 2 or 3 people. Next things I want to talk about, and are probably the most important of all of the ideas in this chapter, are bureaucracies. And this, you know, this is mostly Max Weber's work, right? Max Weber, I don't know if we've talked about him yet, but he is this huge figure in sociology. He's right up there with Emil Durkheim, Karl Marx, Simmel, right? This is like just unbelievably, they just have a huge impact upon the field, right? Kind of one of the founding fathers of sociology, you might say, right? And he had this idea that, he had an idea about rationalization, that society is becoming increasingly rationalized, right? It's being urbanized, it's being industrialized, it's going through political change and revolution, and he would add a fourth thing, it's going through rationalization, right? And basically what he means by that is we attempt to efficiently achieve our goals. First we make goals, and then we seek to efficiently. And bureaucracies are kind of the organization that enables that, right? And he identified some of the key aspects of bureaucracies. And I don't know about you, but when I learned this, I was like, bureaucracies, that's got to be the most boring thing in the world to study, right? Why do I have to learn about this? Well, it turns out that it's very important, and that we spend a huge amount of our lives dealing with bureaucracy. Certainly in college, we deal with the bureaucracy. In government, get your driver's license at the DMV or go to a hospital. Bureaucracies, right? Now, bureaucracies are designed to perform tasks efficiently. That's just how they're designed. It doesn't always do that. Keep that in mind, right? But Weber, and it's spelled Weber, right? But he's German and it's pronounced with a V, right? So Weber identified 6 characteristics, right? And here's what they are. The first is specialization, right? In bureaucracies, we get incredibly specialized tasks to perform. Think of an assembly line, right? Everyone's got their narrow, specific task, or, hospitals or colleges and universities. And I don't teach all the different classes, just kind of a narrow subsection of classes within my subdiscipline within a discipline, right? The next thing is the hierarchy of offices, right? Most organizations, they have one person at the top, right? University is president. Below that, they have dean of student affairs and the provost. Below that, they have the deans of all the colleges, arts and sciences, business, so on, right? And then below that, they have full professors, associate professors. That's my rank within the bureaucracy of higher ed. Then you have assistant professors and instructors and adjuncts, and go on down. And eventually you even have your role as a student within this, right? That's hierarchy of offices, right? And the way that it typically works is the people on top get to tell everyone below them what they have to do within reason, right? And I do not get to tell the dean how to do her job, or the provost, or the president how, right? I can only kind of give instructions to people below me, right? Not above me. And orders kind of go down, right? And so that's specialization, that's hierarchy, and that's when it's rules and regulations. Bureaucracies are full of rules and regulations, right? Yeah, I shouldn't have to persuade you of that. The next thing is you get your position based upon technical competence. You should not get your position as a professor at a university or as a doctor at UAB because you know someone or you're kin to someone, or right? It should be because you have a degree, you have credentials, you're competent at your job, and you can demonstrate that competence, right? Bureaucracies tend to be really impersonal. I'm going to bring up another, right? If you've ever had to get a driver's license, and if you had to do that in Jefferson County, you really experience bureaucracy maybe at its worst, right? And, oh goodness. I'm trying to remember the name. It's over on the other side of Birmingham, kind of no, not Alford. It's over near kind of Birmingham Southern, where it used to be. And there's a big driver's license office there. And you walk in, and they don't ask you what your name is. They tell you get a number, right? And you are that number to them, right? And you sit down and you wait until your number is called. And oftentimes it takes all day for your number to get called, right? That's impersonal, right? Bureaucracies are like this. They're impersonal. Right? You can cry and say, I don't have time to wait all day to get my driver's license. Yeah, they're not going to move you up in the line or anything like that. Because it's like these personal appeals don't matter in bureaucracies, right? And then the last of the 6 key characteristics is formal, written, although increasingly it's digital communications, right? But before information gets digitized and on computers and stuff like that, hospitals had entire buildings that held all the medical files. Universities had entire buildings that held students' files, right? Bureaucracies is just like, dependent upon all sorts of paperwork, fill out forms, Some of that changes when you fill out the form on the computer and doesn't take up physical space, but it's still, tons of written communications, right? Tons of paperwork for everything, right? You want anything accomplished, there's a form you got to fill out first, right? All right, that's kind of the ideal characteristics, is what Weber calls, of bureaucracies, right? They are designed to achieve tasks, goals efficiently, right? But Weber knows that even though they're designed to increase efficiency, oftentimes they don't, right? There's real big problems with bureaucracies. And Weber was quite aware of those problems, right? And he wrote a great deal about those problems, right? So let's talk a little bit about those, right? Well, this is kind of related to that impersonality, right? Bureaucracies tend to alienate people, right? When you reduce a human being to a number, and you stop referring to people by their name and number, that's alienation at its worst, right? You just, if you didn't go to Montevallo, but if you went to a much bigger school like Alabama Auburn, you get the sense that, your professor doesn't know your name, and it's just like you're alienated, right? Hopefully you don't have that experience here at Montevallo with smaller class sizes and things of that sort, right? The next thing is bureaucratic inefficiency and ritualism, right? although they're designed to be efficient, they can become inefficient, right? And let me give you an example. The classic example of ritualism is you go to the emergency room. Let's say you cut your hand off, right? And you walk in the door. You're obviously bleeding out your bloody stump, right? And I need to see a doctor. And the nurse behind the desk says, "Well, fill out these forms in triplicate," right? I'm going to need to see your insurance card. I'm going to need to see your driver's license and so on. And you're like, "What in the world?" And he's like, "Well, everybody has to fill out these forms," right? Everyone has to go through these rituals before you can move on to the next step, right? Now that's an exaggerated example, and hopefully, they wouldn't really make you do that. But as you slowly bled to death, they would put the forms aside. But that's an example of ritualism, right? Bureaucratic ritualism, and how following procedures can get in the way of efficiently providing you medical care, right? The next thing is what's known as bureaucratic inertia. Once a bureaucracy gets going, and there are people that show up to work, and they're making money off of that bureaucracy, it tends to have its own inertia. The best example I can give of this is the March of Dimes. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the March of Dimes, but it's an organization that was started in order to find a cure for polio, right? And, we didn't really find a cure for polio, but we found a vaccine, right? And polio's not, most people don't worry about polio anymore at all, but they used to, right? And one of the ways that we found the money and the funds for that vaccine is through the March of Dimes. So you used to go into a doctor's office, a dentist's office, a waiting room of any sort, and they would have these things like, kind of like look like a frame or something. You could place all your dimes in it. So people would take their pocket change, which when I was younger, everyone had pocket change before the widespread use of credit cards. And you put your pocket change in there, and they mail it off to the March of Dimes when that thing became full of pocket change. And they found a vaccine, and everyone got that vaccine, right? And that took care of polio, right? Now you might think, well, that's surely going to be the end of the March of Dimes, but no. And the reason why it's not the end of March of Dimes is because of bureaucratic inertia. What they do is they pick another goal. They keep the organization and all the employees and the same ways of collecting pocket change and everything, right? The whole structure of everything, and they pick another goal. And I think it was probably in the 80s. It was birth defects, I believe, and that. By shifting to another goal, the bureaucracy remains intact. People continue making money. They raise the money for different cause, slightly different cause, right? But that's bureaucratic inertia. And you see that quite often. When they accomplish their goal, they just come up with a different goal, right? All right. One more problem with bureaucracy is the tendency for there to develop oligarchies, right? There's a fellow named Robert Michaels, and he wrote about this, I guess, like early 1900s, right? And, if you take an economics or a management class, you'll learn about this, right? An oligarchy is the rule of the many by the few. Right? When we have bureaucracies, because of hierarchy, there tends to be just a few people at the top that rule the many, right? Michaels, he called this the iron law of oligarchy. It turns out it's not really an iron law. It's more like a strong tendency than an iron law, right? Um, but yeah, there's a tendency, yeah, for very few people. Even in student organizations and stuff like that, usually there'll be, you know, president of the organization, a secretary, and maybe a vice principal. Or sororities and fraternities tend to be like this. And those people, they make all the important decisions, right? And they rule over the many people below them, right? All right. Now, there's a few other ideas in here about scientific management and how really businesses, big bureaucratic businesses, have, probably for 100 years or so, hired people. They used to call them industrial psychologists is what they used. Now they call it kind of scientific management, and they kind of look at the way that your organization works and measure people's tasks, and then give you advice on how to make your, typically a business or a factory or McDonald's or something, be more efficient, right? That's kind of scientific management, right? And that has been taken to new heights, let's say, right? And and this is where we'll shift gears and we'll talk about George Ritzer's idea of a McDonaldization, right? And this will be really the last thing that I talk about, but it's pretty important. Just like Weber said, there's bureaucracies that help us to organize, or at least design to be more efficient. Ritzer says the same thing, but it's kind of like bureaucracies on steroids, right? And he calls this McDonaldization of society, right? And it's the same thing that Weber identified bureaucracy, but it's like kind of taking it to new heights. It's really obsessive, compulsive implementation of this focus upon efficiency, right? And when he talks about McDonald's, he's talking about McDonald's, the Big Mac, Happy Meal, and all that, right? And he says that they exemplify this way of organizing and thinking and managing, and it's really 4 principles, right? Efficiency, right? If you ever worked in McDonald's, you probably know this, right? Like where the fry machine is, and that there's a alarm on it to tell you the fries are ready, and like how many steps you have to take to do different tasks. It's all laid out. All the kitchen equipment is laid out in a way that people have to make the least amount of steps, right? And it is incredibly efficient, right? And that's one of the reasons why they can continue to sell a Big Mac for a relatively cheap price, right? And everything, so efficiency is the first thing, calculability, everything can be calculated, right? The price of the hamburger patty, the price of labor, right? The price of the screen that replaces the labor, right? Where they want you to use the screen and order from the menu yourself, right? And they've kind of shifted the responsibility of taking orders and placed it on the customer, and have gotten the customer to work for McDonald's, but you don't get a check, right? The uniformity of it all, right? You can, within reason, you can go to a McDonald's anywhere, and a Big Mac's a Big Mac, right? It's not going to taste, it's not like mom and pops, a cheeseburger at mom and pops, where from day to day it might vary, One cook that makes the patties really thick. There might be another one that makes them really thin, right? But not McDonald's, right? This is the uniformity, the predictability, right? And then something I've already mentioned, the control through automation, right? If you can, labor is one of the major expenses of all businesses, right? And if you can eliminate that, right, then you can make that business much more profitable, right? Now you understand, right? If and there are restaurants, I've seen restaurants in Japan where there's, it's made by robots, cooked by robots, served by robots, right? And, if McDonald's can figure out a way to do that, they're probably going to do it. They've already automated the teller and the cashier. And, when you go to Walmart, you're not typically check out yourself, right? That's automation, And AI is going to accelerate that, right? Has already accelerated that, right? And that's good for the corporations. It's not particularly good if you need a job there, right? Because all these jobs are being replaced by automation, by AI, by robots, right? And in some cases, you're doing the labor, right? Like checkout lines and self-checkout lines and stuff like that, right? And if this trend continues, and it most likely will, there are going to be some CEOs of large corporations that are making billions. And there's going to be less and less and less people that work for those corporations. Yeah. And that's not, that's not good. That's you think we have a lot of inequality in our society now, that's only going to exacerbate that, right? And there'll be high rates of unemployment. Yeah, but I could talk about that all day, right? But I won't. Because I'm running up on 47 minutes. I said I was going to keep this short. And I kind of feel like I've done that. I've kept it under 50 minutes, right? But those principles at McDonald's that I talked about, they don't just stay in McDonald's. They get carried elsewhere, and they are incorporated in all domains of our lives. That's what George Ritzer calls the McDonaldization of society. Yeah. He wrote that in the 90s, before AI, right? And it's only getting worse, right? All right, you guys have a nice day.